Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Mr. Sutta here, and today we're going to be learning about the scientific method. Right? We're just going to do a brief overview. We're going to look at the steps of the scientific method and then some related vocabulary. All right, let's get started. All right, so the scientific method is an organized way for scientists or anybody to answer questions and develop solutions. There's usually 6 parts to it. They might be a little bit varied in terms of what you're going to see. So on the left, that's a version of the scientific method. Let's look at the one on the right. So for our scientific method, first we're going to start with a question that we want to answer, something that we're curious about. Then we're going to make a hypothesis that's an educated guess about that question's answer. And then we're going to do an experiment to test our hypothesis, and then we're going to record data from that experiment. After that, we're going to analyze that data and review the results. And lastly, we're going to report the results of our experiment and determine whether our hypothesis from the beginning was correct or not. Right? So that's a quick overview of our steps there. Let's look at them in a little bit more depth now. Right? So here are our steps. So first, we're going to ask a question. When we ask a question, first we have to make observations. But when we make our question, we have to make sure we have accurate phrasing. We have to make sure that the question that we're asking is specific and that it's really getting at what we want to know. Right? After that, we're going to form a hypothesis, which is an educated guess. Usually, hypotheses are going to be in the form of an if-then statement. So, if I place this plant in the sunlight, then it will grow faster. So, usually we're going to use if-then statements. We'll practice that a little bit more later. Right? Next, we're going to test our hypothesis, usually by doing an experiment. And then we're going to analyze our results. Those are going to be the numbers that we recorded during our experiment or other kinds of data. Finally, we're going to draw conclusions. Was our hypothesis right or wrong? And then after that, we're going to communicate our findings. We're going to tell if the hypothesis is right or wrong. Same thing, we're going to tell how if we know if our conclusion is right or wrong too. Remember, science is only good if we can share it with other people, so communicating your findings is a really important part of the scientific method. All right, in order to help you remember the scientific method, you can use this mnemonic device, and found 20 adorable cats. And found 20 adorable dogs and cats, sorry. So and, ask a question. F, found, form a hypothesis. T, 20, test the hypothesis. A, adorable, analyze the results. D, dogs, draw conclusions. And C, cats, communicate findings. And found 20 adorable dogs and cats, right? So that might be something useful for you when you're trying to remember your steps here. Right, now this page has a lot of text on it, but the stuff that's on here is really, really important. So these are our basic terms of the that are going to be used during the scientific method when we do experiments, right? So the first one there is a variable. That's a factor in the experiment that can be controlled, changed, or measured. And then we're going to have the next one is a control. Control is going to be the thing that stays the same so the experiment can be fair. And we'll look at a little bit more on the next slide of what kind of things are controls in an experiment. Then we're going to have the independent variable. That's the part of the experiment that's being tested or changed by the scientist. You can remember I, independent, I change. So the independent is the I change, the thing that the scientist or you yourself, the scientist, is changing in the experiment. It's the thing that you want to know if that has an effect on something. And the last one is our dependent variable or our responding variable. Our responding variable or our measured variable. That's the part of the experiment that's going to be determined by the independent variable. It's the thing that we're trying to see if the independent variable has an effect on. All right, so let's look at some of these terms in action. All right, so here's an example using our variables. How does fertilizer affect the growth rate of plants? That's the question that we're trying to answer. How does the fertilizer affect the growth rate of plants? All right, so we set up an experiment testing different amounts of fertilizer on different plants and measuring the growth of the plants. In this case, we're going to measure the growth using the height of the plants. Right, so what's the independent variable? What's the I change? Right, so the thing that we're changing here is the use of fertilizer. In one experiment, or in one setup, we should have one where it's using fertilizer, another setup where it's not using fertilizer, so we can compare. Right, and then let's move on to our dependent variable. So what's being measured or recorded? How are we going to tell the difference between the setup that has fertilizer and one that doesn't have fertilizer? How are we going to tell whether there was a change in the growth rate? we're going to look at the plant's height, and that's going to be the growth rate of plants. That's the thing that we're measuring to see if the fertilizer has an effect on it. Lastly, we're going to look at our controls. So these are the things that we're going to want to be the same in the experiment, right? So lots of different controls that you can pick. Almost anything you can think of that would make the experiment more fair and consistent across the board between the two setups. So they should be the same type of plant. They should have the same amount of water. They should have the same amount of sunlight. And overall, they should have the same environment. There's a typo in environment. But overall, they should have the same environment. So they should be in the same temperature. It's important that when you're testing that you only have one independent variable because you don't want confusion over what's the thing that's affecting the growth rate of plants. If you had one that had fertilizer but it was in the dark, that plant's not going to grow very well. So you want them to both have everything the same except for one thing that you change. That's your independent variable. The one thing that you change is your independent. And then your dependent is what's going to be measured on top of that. And our controls help to make our experiment more fair and consistent across the board, right? Next, kind of moving on, we have scientific models, right? So a model is a representation of an idea, an object, or even a process or a system that is used to describe and explain phenomena that cannot be experienced directly. You're probably familiar with models. Maybe you've made models in the past. On the right, we can see a model of the water cycle. The water cycle is not a physical thing we can touch and hold, so we can use models. We create like dioramas or things like that in order to represent those ideas. Below that is a model of our solar system there. Obviously, we can't touch and hold all the planets, but we can create a model that'll help to represent our solar system as a whole. Right? There's three types of models that are used in science. We have physical models. For example, a toy rocket and a plastic skeleton are examples of physical models. We have mathematical models. A mathematical model may be made up of numbers, equations, or other forms of data. So, for example, a Punnett square that's used in genetics is an example of a mathematical model, and you'll learn more about that in life science. And lastly, we have conceptual models. So some conceptual models represent systems of ideas. Others compare unfamiliar things with familiar things. We're not going to do too much with conceptual models, but they are a thing that's out there, and we may cover a few of them this year. Next, we have scientific theories. So scientific theories are an explanation that ties together many observations and conclusions, right? So two really important theories that are below here. We have our plate tectonic theory, which involves how our Earth creates more crust, why our continental plates move, why we have volcanoes, all kinds of things like that. On the right, we have a cell, which incorporates cell theory. So back in the olden days, they didn't know what our body was made up of. Now we know it's made up of cells, but that's a theory that's had lots and lots of observations and conclusions and research in order to say, hey, you're a person and you're made up of lots of different things. You have your cells, your tissues, your organs, your organ systems, and then they make up your whole body. And that's incorporated in another theory, our cell theory. And again, you'll learn more about that in life science. So scientific theory is really broad scope, right? And one step further than that is a scientific law. So a scientific law is a summary of many experimental results and conclusions. A law tells you how things work, and laws are usually always true. There may be like rare instances when they're not true, but unless something crazy is happening, our scientific laws are usually upheld. So for example, below is a demo of Newton's third law, which is for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. So the car smashes into the wall of the building, damaging it, but the wall of the building also smashes into the car, which destroys the car, right? And that's an example of a scientific law, right? That's it for scientific method. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.